For Jesus historicists, it's often common to cite the references to Jesus and Josephus. Josephus is a very famous Jewish historian who actually lived in the 1st century, from 37 to 100 CE. Mythicists have been asking for contemporary accounts of a historical Jesus, and Josephus seems to be a popular place to look. Josephus actually wasn't a contemporary, but I guess they figure it's close enough. The Jesus that most people talk about, of course, is the one that was born around the year 0 and died around the year 33. Josephus does mention Jesus, or actually multiple Jesuses, but none of his authentic writing references the Jesus that all Christians know and love. So today, we will be discussing Josephus on Jesus. We will get to the most commonly referred to text in a bit, but first we need to discuss all the different Jesuses that Josephus discusses. The first of these to discuss is Jesus ben Ananias, sometimes referred to as Jesus of Jerusalem. I've talked about this Jesus before in our episode on the Gospel of Mark in our Forged Fiction series, but I will discuss him more in depth here. According to Josephus' work, Jewish War, Jesus ben Ananias was a prophet in the 60s who was famous for prophesying the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple happened in the year 70, but this Jesus, according to Josephus, was talking about its destruction for almost 8 years prior. The Jewish leaders of Jerusalem turned him over to the Romans, who tortured him. But he was declared a madman and released. The narrative of the destruction of the temple in Josephus is eerily similar to the temple narrative in Mark's Gospel. In fact, there are too many parallels for it to be a coincidence. Aside from the fact that both are named Jesus, both come to Jerusalem during a major religious festival. Both entered the temple area to rant against the temple, during which both quote the same chapter of Jeremiah. Both then preach daily in the temple. Both declared woe unto Judea or the Jews. Both predict the temple will be destroyed. Both are, for this reason, arrested by the Jews. Both are accused of speaking against the temple. Neither makes any defense of himself against the charges. Both are beaten by the Jews. Then both are taken to the Roman governor, Pilate in Mark, Albinus in Jewish War. Both are interrogated by the Roman governor, during which both are asked to identify themselves. And yet again, neither says anything in his defense. Both are then beaten by the Romans. In both cases, the Roman governor decides he should release him, but doesn't in Mark and does in Jewish War. Both are finally killed by the Romans, in Mark by execution, and in Jewish War by artillery. Both utter a lament for themselves immediately before they die, and both die with a loud cry. Given the time period, it's likely that Mark actually used Josephus as a source to construct his own temple narrative. Other Jesuses mentioned by Josephus include people like Jesus, son of Onias, and Jesus, the brother of John, who was actually killed by John in the temple. Both of these Jesuses were priests. There was also another Jesus, Jesus, son of Damnius, that we will get to later. We can now start to delve into the juicy parts of this video. The first passage we have to discuss is the infamous Testimonium Flavianum. In Antiquities of the Jews, the passage reads, "And there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if we must really call him a man, for he was a doer of incredible deeds, a teacher of men who received the truth gladly, and he won over many Jews, and also many of the Greeks. This man was the Christ. And when, on the accusation of the leading men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first loved him did not cease to, for he appeared to them on the 3rd day, alive again, the divine prophets having spoken these and countless other marvels about him. And even until now, the tribe of Christians, so named from this man, has not failed." The first question we need to explore is that of this passage's authenticity. The only real debate on this passage's authenticity is whether it is mostly forged or completely forged. To understand why scholars are generally convinced it's a forgery, we don't need to look very far. At a glance, we can tell this paragraph is not something a devout Jew would write. Josephus is usually sophisticated in his writing. explaining anything out of the ordinary to his audience. Christ was not a word in Gentile vocabulary. Josephus would have had to explain what a Christ was and why Jesus was called that. There is no sign of an explanation of this in the passage, which is not something Josephus would just leave hanging. He also would not have written ambiguous phrases like, if we really must call him a man, or doer of incredible deeds, without explaining it to his Gentile audience. He also wouldn't say things like, he won over many Jews and Greeks, without explaining exactly to what he had won them over. Josephus does this for every other sect he discusses. For example, the Pharisees. Now, for the Pharisees, they live meanly, and despise delicacies in diet, and they follow the conduct of reason, and what that prescribes to them as good for them they do, and they think they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay a respect to such as are in years, nor are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced. And when they determine that all things are done by fate, they do not take away the freedom from men of acting as they think fit, since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make a temperament, whereby what he wills is done, but so that the will of man can act virtuously or viciously. They also believe that souls have an immortal rigor in them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments, according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life, and the latter are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but that the former shall have power to revive and live again, on account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people, and whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and their discourses also. Josephus does a similar thing for the Sadducees. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with their bodies, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. For they think it is an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine is received but by a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. And so on for every group he mentions. No such explanation exists for the Christians, which only get mentioned once. The problems with this passage don't end there. Why does Josephus mention Jesus appearing on the third day? This is a Christian creedal statement that Josephus certainly would not have used without explaining it. What did it mean? Did Jesus escape his persecution? Did he appear in a dream or as a phantom? This is clearly not the writing of Josephus. In fact, we can quite easily demonstrate how every sentence in this passage cannot be from the hand of Josephus. Eventually, we are left with the bones. And there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, after which no story follows. As we have already discussed, Josephus mentions several people named Jesus, but he always does us the favor of telling us who they are and more of their story. No such thing exists in this passage. That's just from examining the passage alone. Even more evidence stacks up when we look at it in context. The following paragraph starts, "About the same time also another sad calamity put the Jews into disorder." Another sad calamity. There was just a glowing advertisement for Jesus. What sad calamity could Josephus be talking about? Oh, that's right, the passage before the Testimonium Flavianum. In that passage, Pilate sets his soldiers loose to massacre a large crowd of Jews in Jerusalem. This certainly makes sense as a sad calamity. This entire section would read so much better if the testimonium wasn't there. In fact, the chapter flows nicely and makes perfect sense without it. Perhaps the biggest giveaway is the fact that no one seems to notice the existence of this passage until the 4th century. Not even Church Father Origen, who quotes Josephus extensively in his writing. This verse is just the kind of thing you would expect to see Christians keep track of, but we just don't see it for the first 300 years of its supposed existence. Tertullian, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and more could have easily referenced this passage anywhere in their writings, but it just doesn't happen. In fact, an increasing amount of scholars seem to think Eusebius actually wrote the Testimony of Flavianum. I already made a video concerning my thoughts on Eusebius, so feel free to click the card if you're interested in that. Simply the way he discusses Jesus isn't the way Josephus would do that. Josephus actually writes about 4 other prophets running around at the time, and they all seem to play a special role in the Jesus story. Josephus is avidly against calling any of them messiahs, even though it's clear that their messianic basis is unmistakable. He refers to them as having evil or dishonorable intentions instead, sometimes calling them charlatans. The Samaritan, for example, gathered followers and said he would reveal the lost relics of the true Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, an act with obvious messianic meaning. The Samaritans believed themselves to be the true Jews. This is even alluded to in John 4:20-26, which attests that the Samaritans also expected an imminent Messiah. The original Jewish congregation led by Joshua had stood at God's command, quote, upon Mount Gerizim to bless people, after crossing the Jordan, in Deuteronomy 27:12, which is to say, when Joshua crossed the Jordan on the day the nation of Israel was conceptually begun. Thus, Joshua inaugurated the nation of Israel by crossing the Jordan and congregating at Gerizim. And since the last Messiah, Joshua, was to reconstitute Israel, he too could expect to begin the task by a blessing on Mount Gerizim. The Egyptian also gathered followers and preached from the Mount of Olives, just as Jesus did in the Gospels. He claimed that he would topple the walls of Jerusalem, an obvious allusion to the miraculous felling of the walls of Jericho, another deed of Joshua. Preaching from the Mount of Olives could also imply messianic pretensions, as it was commonly believed a Messiah would stand there in the last days, as is shown in Zechariah 14:1-9. Thus, the Egyptian was preaching another metaphor for the reconquest of Israel, again, the very task only the Christ was expected to accomplish. Another unnamed impostor mentioned by Josephus gathered followers and promised them salvation if they followed him into the wilderness. This is an obvious reference to Moses. This impostor created symbolic allusions to the temptation narrative in Exodus as well, promising rest in the wilderness and deliverance from evil. So just as those who tempted God in the wilderness lost their God-promised rest, those who ritually reversed this behavior could expect to see the restoration of God's promise. It is clear that all these supposed messiahs were trying to imitate prophets and patriarchs from the Old Testament. Whoever actually wrote the Testimonium was aware that this was the book they had to place it in, although the placement in the book was actually chosen poorly. There are other reasons to think this passage is a later Christian forgery, such as the actual structure of it and its relation to passages in Luke. There is one more person claiming to be a Messiah that is discussed in Josephus that we have yet to study. This is the story of the legendary and somewhat problematic Theudas. Josephus writes, "Now it came to pass, while Theudas was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them, and follow him to the river Jordan, for he told them that he was a prophet, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river, and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Theudas did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who, falling upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them, and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive, and cut off his head, and carried it to Jerusalem. This is what befell the Jews in the time of Cuspius Fatus's government." Theudas said he would part the Jordan River. This is obviously another allusion to Joshua the prophet, who had parted the Jordan himself in Joshua chapter 3. In biblical scholarship, the sole reference to Theudas presents a problem of chronology. In Acts, Gamaliel, a member of the Sanhedrin, defends the apostles by referencing to Theudas. "Men of Israel, be cautious in deciding what to do with these men. Some time ago, Theudas came forward, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. But he was killed, and his whole following was broken up and disappeared. After him came Judas the Galilean at the time of the census. He induced some people to revolt under his leadership, but he too perished, and his whole following was scattered. The difficulty is that Gamaliel, speaking before the year 37, is described as referring to the rising of Theudas, linking it to the revolt of Judas of Galilee at the time of the census of Quirinus decades before, in 6 CE. However, Josephus makes clear that the revolt of Theudas took place in around the year 45, which is after Gamaliel is said to have spoken, and long after the time of Judas the Galilean. To me, this is further evidence of Acts being written originally as historical fiction. Either that, or the author of Acts, Luke, who we knew used Josephus as a source, had copied something down wrong. Either way, this is still an unresolved issue. At this point, we have discussed the testimonium and the myriad of reasons we know it's not written by Josephus. The language is nothing like the language Josephus would have used. The lack of details, the poor placement in the narrative, how he talks about other prophets, and more problems all point to this passage being a later Christian forgery. In the writings of Josephus, there is, however, one more section we must discuss: the James reference. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. When in discussions about the historical Jesus, this will inevitably come up. After all, why would Josephus reference a brother of Jesus if Jesus wasn't a real person? A mythical man can't have a real brother, so of course, this is the nail in the coffin for mythicists. Or is it? In context, this passage describes the antics of Annas, a very unpopular high priest in Jerusalem who assembled the Sanhedrin council and brought charges against James and his companions, and condemned them all to be stoned to death. This caused an uproar, and citizens complained to King Agrippa, who took the high priesthood from Annas and made Jesus, the son of Damnius, high priest. The passage is likely not a forgery. A forger would not write such a small amount. A forger would have made it much more evident that they were there. There is really no political agenda to push in this narrative if this were a forgery. All in all, there would be no point in forging it. But just because it's not a forgery per se, doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with it. There are several clues that point to this passage not talking about the Jesus we're familiar with. The first of these clues is the fact that this account contradicts all other accounts of the death of James. Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria agree that James, the head of the Jerusalem church, died alone by the hands of an angry mob. Another questionable feature is the fact that we see the use of the word Christ again. As stated previously, a devout Jew like Josephus would not have used that language, and if he did, he would have explained what he meant by it in far greater detail, or any detail at all for that matter. Richard Carrier has shown that the inclusion of who was called Christ is exactly what a scribe would put in the margins as a note. A later scribe would have seen this and probably written it into the sentence while copying it. Another issue is the fact that there is no reference to this in Acts. It seems silly to think that a Christian who had claimed to research the history of the church, as Luke does in Luke 1:1-4, would not mention the fate of James, the brother of Jesus. In fact, Luke makes a point of always depicting the Romans protecting or rescuing Christians from the excesses of Jewish persecution or other dire fates. This is seen in his narratives on Gallio, Lysias and Festus, and the Roman guards. One of the things that strikes me most is the wording of this passage. In its current form, it looks nothing like something Josephus would have written. In all other passages referencing the brother of somebody, Josephus has a certain way of putting it. His formula has always been X, the brother of Y, such as Aaron, the brother of Moses, Germanicus, the brother of Caesar, Antiochus, the brother of Demetrius, and so on. When I look at this, I don't see the writing of Josephus. But we can't just not consider the context of this passage. Why would Josephus mention the trial of the brother of Jesus out of the blue? Who is this Jesus? Why is Annas after his brother? The context easily answers these questions for us. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, King Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus compiled with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananus, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him, when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Damnius, high priest. If this is the Jesus whose brother Ananus killed, then it explains why the punishment was to depose of Ananus and install in his place the brother of the man he unjustly killed. Certainly it is more plausible that Josephus meant Jesus, son of Damnius, than that Josephus just mentioned some different Jesus out of the blue, with a strange lack of any digression on who this Jesus was, leaving the reader wondering, who's that? In fact, imagine if you were an ancient reader of the text. What would you conclude? You would ask yourself, who's this Jesus guy? Even if the one called Christ was tacked on, most readers would not know what that meant, or why it had anything to do with Ananus going after his brother. Then you would read on and see, that's the Jesus. That is, since Josephus doesn't tell you who this Jesus is, there is only one Jesus he leaves his reader to infer that it is, Jesus, son of Damnius. In conclusion, the Testimonium Flavianum is certainly a forgery, and the later reference to James, the brother of Jesus, was almost certainly a scribal error. When we consider all the evidence, it certainly seems as though Josephus never actually mentions the Jesus we are all so fond of.